So the US is well known to be one of the most aggressive tax countries in the world. It might surprise you to know that my main operating company for the businesses that I run is actually a US company, specifically something called a US LLC. And this is in fact a very common structure for online entrepreneurs who live globally, just like me. So you might be asking yourself, why the heck would someone have a setup like this if they don't live in the United States? Well, it's because, believe it or not, as aggressive as the US is towards its citizens and its residents, it's actually very non-aggressive towards people who don't live or reside in the US and who have businesses there. Specifically, if you have an LLC, which stands for a limited liability company, but you as the owner of the company do not operate that business out of the US, that company can actually potentially get 0% tax within the US. And that is what makes this structure such a useful one for global online entrepreneurs like myself. For example, in my case, despite the fact that I live myself in the UAE and I also have a UAE company, my main operating company that I actually operate my businesses through is actually a US LLC. And that US LLC is in turn owned by my UAE holding company, which is in turn owned by me. You might be asking yourself, what is the point of this structure? You're going to get 0% tax anyway if you make below the small business threshold. So where is the point in setting up this convoluted structure, and who is this actually useful for? Well, that is exactly what I'm going to explain to you in this video. And I'm also going to tell you exactly how you can set up a US LLC and have it owned by perhaps a holding company or yourself personally, whatever you prefer, how much it's all going to cost, and when is it actually going to make sense, and when is this just unnecessary overcomplication. And with that said, there are actually some very major caveats to this, so make sure you watch this video all the way through, because it's not actually as simple as setting up a US LLC and
woohoo, now you have 0% tax.
It's actually quite a bit more nuanced than that. And you might end up in big trouble in either the US or the country where you live if you don't do things properly. But before we move on, we need to first understand what is a US LLC and how does this actually differ from a normal business structure. Well, generally, the way it works is that a business is a separate legal entity from its owner, meaning that any legal liabilities and things like this that fall to the company are dealt at the company level and then cannot essentially go through this corporate structure and hurt the owner personally. Similarly, the way companies are normally taxed is that the companies are taxed on the profits that the company makes after expenses. And there are special corporate tax rates that are applied for that income. And you, as the owner of the business, are paid separately as either a salary or a dividend, depending on how you decide to essentially pay yourself. Now, in terms of the legal protection side, the LLC is exactly the same, broadly speaking, as any normal business structure. But where it differs is how it is taxed. Specifically, the way the LLC is taxed is that the LLC itself is not taxed as a corporation unless you elect to do so, and there's like more complicated cases. But generally, the kind of LLC we're talking about is not taxed separately. It is not taxed on its profits. Rather, all of the profits of the company are automatically passed on. Essentially, they flow through to the members, so essentially the owners of the LLC. The way you can think of this is that any profit that the LLC makes is automatically paid out in proportion to all of its owners, rather than being able to be kept in the company and benefiting from those lower corporate tax rates like with a normal company. So is this structure generally used over something called a C corporation in the US, which is the more normal business structure of the US? Well, there's a couple of reasons. First of all, it's a lot more simple to set up. The accounting is more simple. It's just a cheaper business structure to operate, and it is thus better for smaller and leaner operations. And we could go over this in more detail, but the point here is not to compare it to like the other business structures in the US. The point here is to talk about specifically why is this structure so interesting for non-US residents, so people who don't live in the US. So in general, it is fully possible for you to form a company wherever in the world, even if you don't live in that place. Normally, the way that will then work is that that company, let's say you set up a company in France, but you don't live in France, that company might still be taxed in France, even if you don't live there. Now, I don't know the specifics of French law, but usually that is how it works. Now, of course, you would then have double tax agreements and things like this to take care of any double taxation. But generally, the benefit of a US LLC is that if you are a non-US resident, that US LLC will not be taxed in the US. It's essentially going to have a 0% tax in the US, provided that certain criteria are met. Note, this is 0% US tax. That doesn't mean that you have no tax anywhere. We'll get back to that point in a moment because it's quite important. There are a couple of conditions for this. So if you read about this in the actual law of the US business law, what it will say is that non-resident aliens, aka a fancy word for people not living in the US or citizens of the US, are taxed on business income only if that business is quote unquote engaged in a trade or business in the United States. And this trade or business in the United States is going to be triggered in a couple of cases. First of all, if you have at least one what's called a dependent agent in the US, i.e., and a dependent agent can mean employees, like regular contractors, actual people physically working and operating within the United States while working for your US LLC. If you have even one of those in the US, you will be taxed in the US just like any other company. The other case is if you operate within the US through this company through what's called a permanent establishment, i.e. if you spend enough time in the US where the IRS can essentially claim that there is a permanent place of business within the US for this business, aka which will make it a US business and it's going to be taxed normally just like any other US business. If neither of these cases are met, that means the US will not tax this LLC because it is a non-resident LLC. So with that said, how can you go about setting up a US LLC and what are the annual reporting requirements of running this? What I did is I used a service online called Doula. Essentially, it's a company who will just set everything up for you. You get a ton of other benefits. You get a CPA consultation. They will take care of all of the forms that you need to fill out in the US, because while it is not going to be taxed in the US, there's still a couple of forms that you will need to fill out if you want to keep this compliant with all the laws. And not filing these or filing them incorrectly can lead to some very, very hefty fines. So you want to make sure that you either do this very correctly or you use an agent who will do this for you. Doula is the platform that I use. I haven't used any other, so I don't know how good it is compared to the other ones. But if you want to use them, I've left my affiliate link down below, which they have provided for me. Do your research about all the different providers and choose what is the best for you. It's a very easy business to maintain. All you have to do is file those couple of forms every single year. And other than that, you don't really need to do anything on the US side. But what is important to know is the big caveat of this is that just because you're not taxed in the US with this company doesn't mean that you're not taxed on it anywhere. This is so important. You cannot simply operate a US LLC from France and think that France is not going to tax that US LLC. The way companies are generally taxed is based on where they are resident, aka based on where they operate, not necessarily based on where they are registered. They would usually also be taxed on where they're registered. For example, a UAE company is always going to be taxed in the UAE regardless of where it is run, but if that UAE company is also run from, aka managed and controlled from France, France is also going to tax that company as a French resident company. What is great about the US LLC is that you don't have to deal with the US taxes at all, and you can simply focus on the tax rules of the country where you actually reside. Why would you do this when you can just have a local company as your operating company? Well, there's a couple of cases. Well, I could imagine a case where, let's say you live in some weird country that doesn't have very good business infrastructure, that is not very trusted. Having a US LLC as your main company is going to be a lot easier. It's going to have a better infrastructure. You typically rather have a US company than a Nigerian company or something like that. So in general, the US has very good banking infrastructure. In many cases, simply getting access to a US bank account can be extremely useful. Now, maybe it is not, maybe it is, but you'll need to decide for your specific business whether this is actually useful. But this is one main reason. You get better payment processing. This is actually the core reasons why I personally have a US LLC as my operating company. The thing is, when I was trying to sell my coding courses online via this platform called Stripe, and I was doing it via my UAE company directly, what was happening is I was getting a ton of declined payments, because basically a lot of credit cards would see a UAE company charging the card and they would block the payment as a high risk payment. So having that US LLC as essentially a layer on top of your perhaps main holding company is going to give you that trust, and it's going to literally increase the conversion rates on your checkout pages, because their cards are not being declined, because the cards are way more likely to accept a charge from a US company than from a company in some lower tier jurisdiction. And overall, it simply looks better to have a US business. Most people, especially if you're selling to somewhere in the West, perceptions matter. If people see that they're buying from a company in Thailand, they might still buy, but they're going to have a few second thoughts. And overall, in the big picture, that's going to lead to some people to literally refuse to buy because they don't trust your company. If you have a US company, most people are going to trust a US company because, let's be honest, most of the things we buy all the time anyway are from US companies. So that is the main reason why so many people have a structure like this. To conclude, simply getting access to US business infrastructure, US payment infrastructure, US banking infrastructure is in many cases going to be extremely useful. Now, not in all cases, so you're going to need to do research for your specific use case for all these benefits that I just listed actually important to you. I know a lot of friends who live in the UAE who don't need any of this because they don't have any issues having UAE bank accounts. UAE bank accounts are also really great, so usually you wouldn't have issues. It's usually specifically in cases like this we need to directly charge cards. I've heard a lot of people with UAE companies having issues, which is why having this layer on top of it with the US LLC is very, very useful. And nowadays UAE companies are becoming more and more popular, so it's less and less important to have this unless you have these very, very specific cases where it's useful. But do your own research. So I hope that video was helpful to you. I hope maybe it gave you some food for thought, maybe it gave you something to think about on whether something like this might be useful for your business. Like always, make sure to do your own research. This is not tax advice, anything like that. With that said though, if you want to understand more about what is it like to run a business in the UAE specifically, I made this video right here that you can check out. With that said, I'll see you in the next video.